Again, thank you all for coming. I'm Melba Newsome. I am an adjunct professor here in the School of Journalism and the program coordinator for the Environmental and Epistemic Justice Initiative. So this next panel that we're having is is mental health, but it's basically mental health and brain health in the era of climate crisis, the impacts of the environment and climate change on our mental health and our brain health. So we are very fortunate today to have a great panel to join us. We have Dr. Goldie Byrd. She's professor of public health sciences and the former director of the Maya Angelou Center for Health Equity. And Dr. Byrd is a former dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at North Carolina A&T. And while serving as dean there, Dr. Byrd founded the Center for Outreach in Alzheimer's, Aging, and Community Health, which is a cross-disciplinary community-engaged center funded by the university and corporate partnerships. She conducts research on the genetics of Alzheimer's in African Americans to try to understand the genetic variants that might attribute to the increased burden of Alzheimer's in this population. She has too many awards to mention, so I would just say she got a whole ton of them. Okay. So next up, another person with a whole ton of awards in a different sphere is Lisa Sorg. She is the North Carolina reporter for Inside Climate News. She's also an adjunct journalism professor here at Wake Forest. She's been a journalist for some 30 years. She covers energy, climate, environment and agriculture, as well as the social justice impacts of pollution and corporate malfeasance. She's award-winning public service and investigative journalist. She received the Stokes Award and the National Press Foundation Awards for a two-part story about the environmental damage from a former missile plant on Black and Latino in the Burlington neighborhood, in a neighborhood in Burlington. And she was previously an environmental investigative reporter at Newsline. She tells me that she wakes up every day with rage about the many injustices and atrocities that are committed in this country and in this state and in this country. And so we're kindred spirits in that way. So Dr. Morey is a professor of psychiatry and behavioral scientist at Duke University, professor of neuroscience and psychology at Duke, and is also a professor at the Duke Institute of Brain Sciences. In his lab, his work is focused on brain changes associated with post-traumatic stress disorder, traumatic brain injury, and other neuropsychiatric disorders. So he applies several advanced methods, including functional MRI, structural MRI, and genetics to his research. And he's also looking at the effects of climate change on trauma, PTSD, depression, anxiety, and the brain. So each of our guests will give a presentation, and then we will be followed by conversation and a question and answer with the audience. So first, Dr. Byrd, thank you.
Thank you, Melba. I just learned that Melba has a mean golf game. All right.
She beat me like a rented.
No, rented, you have the most. Oh my God. Good morning. It's my great pleasure to be here, and thank you, Melba, for the invitation to come and to share this morning. As she says, I'm former director of the Maya Angelou Center for Health Equity, and I proudly say that that's my first step toward full retirement. But as several in the room have said, I probably won't retire anytime soon completely. Let me just say that that center's name is being changed. that center's name will not have equity in it. And so, and not only that center, but other centers and institutes, both locally and nationally associated with our institution. So my talk this morning, don't worry, I'm not going to give you a genetics lecture, and neither am I going to give you a lot on Alzheimer's, the physiology of it. Just going to bring to your attention several things that relate to environmental justice and justice in general. So I've been working in this space for about 25 years. I began this work at Duke University, actually. And I was there on sabbatical because I was getting ready to change my research focus, and I wanted to do my research in an area that really impacted underserved communities. And so I did my due diligence, and I went on to do PubMed searches to find out what was going on with Alzheimer's disease, and particularly those in underrepresented groups. So I was actually working with some of the top people in the world, actually, at Duke, who were doing Alzheimer's genetics. And I knew I wanted to do what was new at that time, which was a genome-wide association study, which is a big study that looks all across the human genome to see if there are genetic variants that predispose individuals to a disease, and in this case, Alzheimer's disease. So as we were talking about the following 2.5 years that I was going to spend there doing this work, I knew I wanted to do that genome-wide association study. And the person I was working with said, you have to be out of your mind, because in order to do that study, as you know, you will have to have thousands of individuals participating in that work. And right now, I've got 8,000 white folks in my study, in my DNA bank, and I've got exactly 43 Black and no Hispanic, and absolutely no indigenous Americans in my DNA bank. And so that created a little problem. And so we decided what we would do is make a lot of noise around this work and around the disadvantage of including all populations, white, Black, blue, or green, rich, poor, rural, urban, suburban, in studies. Now, the National Institutes of Health actually had already been doing that on paper and saying that it wanted to include everybody in studies, because you cannot generalize anything about any study unless you do that. However, it was still granting major grants, and it still does, when that was not the case. That was not a requirement. So how does that relate to environment? Let me just say that. And I know I spent 2 or 3 minutes on that, but I promise you I'm going to be in less than 15 minutes. So I agree with Dr. King in the sense that nobody should be worried about inequality around health or anything else, and that one of the worst is around health and your access to care. And all of the things we already heard about on the previous panel impact our health and well-being. So the race, ethnicity, where we live, our socioeconomic status, none of these things should play a role in our health outcomes, but actually they do. So then we measure these things by any number of metrics like life expectancy, access to health care, access, geographic and provider level differences. And one of the things I wish I had time to talk more about is this rurality, this geography, where people live. Whether you live downstream from the factory or whether you live in an area where there are no trees and canopy, blah, blah, and how really that impacts health in general. So I'll try to be as global as I can. And then the last one there is lack of representation in research and clinical trials, which is where I've spent a lot of my time in the Alzheimer's space, trying to improve generalizability of our findings. And what again, when we have these disparate issues around health and access and our local and global environment, then our life expectancies are different. And so, I hope you can see that, but you can see that across these particular groups of individuals, our life expectancy at birth is very, very different. As a matter of fact, I'm going to show you some slides in a minute that we don't even have to look globally. We can just look right here in Winston-Salem, that between communities, there's like two really significant communities in East Winston, and then down in Buena Vista, about anywhere from a 10 to 14 different year difference in life expectancy right here in Winston-Salem. So if you look across North Carolina, then these same groups have disparate. And actually, this talk really is beyond race and ethnicity. And because we know for sure that race is not a biological construct. We created race. Race is not biological. So the work we do is actually, we look at ancestry, because race is what we created based upon how we separated people and how we expose ourselves to these communities. So if you look at geographic health disparities, then are due primarily to racially discriminating policies, and that it's no different here in local Winston-Salem, and I'll share some things with you. So if you look at the high-income countries around the globe, you see that the United States has more health disparities than any other high-income country. And yet we're growing in our diversity. We're mixing communities, and we should have that opportunity if we want to do that. There should not be a limit on our diversity. And there's growing angst about that. So if you look at then diversity, wealth, and life expectancy, you can see that this wealth inequity is really wreaking havoc on our communities and our overall health and wealth. So it determines where we can live and what kind of air we can breathe, what kind of access we have, how much taxes we pay, as a matter of fact. And so if you look at these three groups then, just Black, Hispanic, and white, what you see then is that there are these huge wealth gaps, and that has a financial security, has a huge impact on our health outcomes. And then, of course, the intergenerational transmission of wealth and health has a huge impact. So if a person cannot own a home, then the person can't pass that home, which is the number one factor for considering long-term wealth, is home ownership. And that's really stark here in Winston-Salem. So if we look at our exposome, then a diverse range of exposures that impact human health. So this idea was conceptualized a couple of decades ago. The National Institutes of Health discovered these four major themes. We're talking about technological advancements to assess ADRD, and that's Alzheimer's disease and related disorder risk, impact of the exposome across the life course, and that even begins in utero, how a woman is cared for when the baby is in utero, and these risks increase throughout life unless there is intervention. And then, of course, then just general lifestyle and environmental impacts, and then the importance of just integrating all of this data together to understand how we are exposed to increased risk of disease in general. All right. And then so as we think about environmental exposures, we think about health outcomes in general, we in the biomedical science community need to think about uncovering all of the root causes of disease, and there are many. Interestingly, my work began with trying to understand genetics of Alzheimer's, and it really has morphed into understanding those social drivers and environmental factors, which may be as important or more important as the genetic factors that expose us. As a matter of fact, our environmental factors also impact our genetic factors through epigenetics. So this idea of improving health, improving our environment, improving our social lives is so critical to what we do, and we can now say that. Unfortunately, DEI and woke have been so misinterpreted and so miscast that even studies like ours could get terminated because we have tried to be inclusive, not exclusive. And so these terms that are being tossed around, I mean, who wouldn't want a diverse population when you're studying anything? Who wouldn't want an equitable access to it when you're just studying anything? Who wouldn't, want to be inclusive of all populations when you're studying anything? And yet these terms, I was lecturing to a group of medical students a couple of weeks ago, and we talked about which of these three components would you not want to be considered. Interesting comments they made. So these social drivers then, as we say, are more and more becoming more important in our world, in biomedical science, as we study these other physiological impacts on health outcomes. So if you look at North Carolina, we are divided into 100 counties, and they are divided, they're labeled in tiers. So tier 1s are the most distressed counties. Tier 2s, there are about 40 of those. Tier 2s are a little less distressed. And then the tier 3s are the least distressed. So you can really track disease in certain counties down to the zip code of where chronic disease access based on what that county looks like and the resources there and whether or not there's access to medical professionals, where there's education, high socioeconomic status. Tell me when I have about 2 minutes. Thank you. And so we are able now to predict risk based on a number of different factors. So if you look at our rural counties, and North Carolina really basically is a rural state. I think it's about 60%. I can't remember the exact number right now. But what we know is that in our rural counties, our health is worse. Again, access, education, socioeconomic status. And we have to look within counties, within zip codes, and within communities because the health and wealth gaps are so wide. So understanding the disadvantages of lumping has been very, very important to us as well. And then here, of course, in Winston-Salem, I don't have to tell you about Highway 52 and what it did to hundreds of family members here. And it left the scourge, really, in certain areas. It left communities where they were not able to get the education they need, the upward mobility. And it was, people remembered that. And so as we as investigators and people who want to make a bridge between our institution and the community have to factor that in terms of getting access to these communities and helping people to trust in the work we do. And that's part of the work we did at Maya Angelou Center, is to try to help people understand that their issues are very valid. There's truth in the way people were treated and the way communities have been left to fend for themselves pretty much. At the same time, if we work together as communities of higher ed, communities of health and wealth, we're all better off. Got 2 minutes? And so if you look then at what happened after Highway 52, if you look at upward mobility, median household income, and just the spatial injustice in the community, you can see we have a huge problem. It is political. It is, and understanding, as we talked about, that the politics of health is really crucial and important for us to share with communities impacted. So again, my study is in Alzheimer's disease, huge disparities in this disease, most common in women and in people of color, but really in people with low socioeconomic status. In other words, it all comes back to some of the very same factors we talked about in general. And this is pretty much true for almost any chronic disease. These very same factors are very important. We can predict disease pretty much. We're in the stroke belt, so the southern states are going to be most impacted. This recent study by Keck showed that the environmental pollution may contribute to the racial and ethnic disparities in Alzheimer's risk. And it's because individuals who are more likely to live in these most impacted neighborhoods are going to have increase. So there's this direct link between our environment and our social well-being and our environmental well-being and chronic disease. And then this slide just shows that for a disease like this one, it just doesn't start at 60 years old, that when a person gets a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, at about 60, they will have already had it for 10 to 15 years, which suggests that we must begin to think about intergenerational health and health earlier than those ages where we think about chronic disease. And again, local and personal environments, these are modifiable risk factors, not as easy as it looks. Nice, pretty slide here. Not as easy as it looks, but the Lancet Commission says if we could control what happens to our lives with regard to health and wealth and environment in early, middle, and late life, we could probably reduce dementia by about 45%. When it comes to building out the research we do, when it comes to building drugs that impact this disease, there are only 2 that have been approved by the FDA that actually mitigate the disease, not just impact the symptoms. There are only 2 of those, and one of the primary reasons you don't have people with low socioeconomic status. So in other words, the same people that have the most disease are the least ones to participate in research and clinical trials that actually help to mitigate the disease. So this is a problem. These are environmental influences, social influences, socioeconomic influences, very same things. If you look across many chronic diseases, you get the same picture. So these are the 2 drugs, and less than 5% underrepresented groups in these 2 very important and expensive drugs. Just want to say that building trust in communities, I think the team in front of us already talked about that, engaging community, hearing voices of community, and doing the things that really impact the well-being of communities will help us in this polycrisis, as you called it. And I'll just stop right there. We're aging. We need a better climate. We need a better social justice initiatives, and we need to be very aware of what our communities are going through. I'll stop right there.
There we go.
Because, and how I'm going to do this is I tell stories for a living. And so I'm going to give my presentation in a series of stories. And this is mostly about the eastern hurricane disasters, but it's a cautionary tale for Helene, because that's going to be decades long, and there are going to be people who are going to suffer for a very long time. I'll start this by saying, earlier this year I met a man named Mr. Curtis Washington. He lived in Goldsboro in a historic house that he had inherited from his family. It was heavily damaged during Hurricane Matthew, which was in 2016. He still had not been home. He was living with friends, and this is 8 years after the funding, or 7 years after the funding had become available, and he still, not one thing had been done to his house. He died on the 8th of April. He was 68 years old. He passed in his sleep. He is one of at least 12 people that I know of that never got back home. They died. And they were either survivors of Florence or Matthew. And they were in a program called Rebuild North Carolina, Rebuild NC, that has a long history of malfeasance, waste, fraud, and abuse. And I did 31 stories about this agency, and the things that I saw and learned were astonishing. So what you're seeing on this first slide is some houses that were damaged and had been, the one in Aden had been there for years. These are people who were out of their homes, living in motels for up to 4 years. I see some folks who used to work for legal aid. They know these stories. Here is one. These were the Williamses. Willie Williams and his wife, Geraldine. I got a letter one day, and this said, "My name is Willie Williams, and I've been living in this motel for 4 years." They did not have a kitchen. Ms. Williams gave herself dialysis 10 hours a day in that motel room for 4 years. He had written the Attorney General. He had written the governor. He had written every single elected official he thought of. I was the only one who called him. And so what I found as I was reporting on these folks is that they just wanted someone to listen to them. I mean, they wanted results, but no one was listening. No one returned their call. No one at Rebuild returned their call. They'd gone through 15 case managers. Their houses were in limbo. They were not getting any communication. 4 years. And instead, they're sitting in an extended stay. for, like I said, many years. And meanwhile, the people at Rebuild, there were, I think, 30 people making more than $100,000 a year, some up to like 150, to do what I don't know. Well, I think I know, but I can't say publicly. These are the Roberta and Franklin, lovely couple. They lived in a motel for 3 or 4 years. Roberta caught COVID twice because she could not be separated from her daughter, who was also living with them, who had a daughter who went to school. And so the daughter brought COVID home from her elementary school, home being the motel. Franklin had a stroke. I saw Franklin last year. He came to an event in Goldsboro, and they're home now. But he started crying, and this goes back to the PTSD I think you're going to be speaking to. He says, "I will never be made whole." He was crying. He says, "I'm home, but I don't know how to be at home." Also, some of these homes were built incredibly poorly. His house has fallen apart. There are more than 800 warranty claims right now against the houses that were built because they were built so poorly. So I think I read something as I was reporting. It was called, it was an academic literature called Bureaucratic Violence, which I had never considered before. But bureaucratic violence is when you make a system so Byzantine, so impossible to navigate, that it's basically, its own form of oppression. And I would say that definitely comes in to account here. I'll show you a picture of this guy here on the left, Hal Lauder. He was a hurricane survivor in Whiteville. He is the emergency management director in Columbus County. He could not even figure it out. Now, if the guy whose business it is to be in the emergency management business can't figure out the process, what is someone who doesn't have the internet, who's 85 years old, who, like a guy named Danny Lofton. Danny lived in Goldsboro when the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers opened the dam during Hurricane Matthew. His house flooded. He was rescued by boat. Its own trauma. The man is visually impaired, and his job he had was a janitor. He tried and tried to get into the program, could not get in the program, was ignored. Finally, he went to live with some friends who were elderly. They died of natural causes. He had nowhere to go. So he took what little savings he had from his janitor job, and he bought an old car. And he slept in it one winter while the program continued to kick the can down the road. He did finally get home. It took several years and some community advocates. But the other thing that I want to mention about Danny Lofton, and there's a lot of folks like this, and it's very racially based, is Danny lives in a 100-year floodplain. The reason he lives in a 100-year floodplain is because white people put him there. We put black folks, brown folks, in the worst land in the 100-year floodplain, and then the hurricanes come, and we wonder why they're flooded out. And now we have a strategic buyout program, which, I'm mixed about. I understand why people would want to participate in that. But now we white saviors want to come in and pull them out of the 100-year floodplain. You shouldn't be in there. Well, you shouldn't, but we shouldn't have put them there. Sorry, I'm getting, as you can tell. My rage is returning. The woman on the right, her name was LaVon. I'm not sure if she's still alive. She had cancer at the time. She was testifying before the legislature about how badly she'd been treated. Her house was under construction. It only had one door, which is not code, by the way. You're supposed to have 2 doors in your house at least. And then this, I think, Johnny, and you'll know this house. This is Mr. Harrell. Mr. Harrell was a Hurricane Matthew survivor. His house he lived in a motel for 4 years. And this is the state that his contractors left his home after they fixed it. This is the carport. This is illegal. This is a breach of contract. They're supposed to clean up after themselves. Mr. Harrell, I talk to him all the time. We've become friends. And he is still traumatized. When he was going through all this, he would call me at 9, 10 o'clock at night and just cry. He would just cry because he didn't know what to do. He was beside himself. So I tell you these stories to tell you that the climate crisis, while we may have a sense of existential dread about us all marinating in our juices in 10 years, it's happening now. The trauma is now. The PTSD is now. If you were in Helene, I was at a meeting in Asheville where a man said, I hear it begin to rain and it triggers me. So these are not future problems. These are now. These are damaging these folks' quality of life. I think all of these folks would say, you cannot make me whole. It will never be. And on top of the trauma of, having survived a storm, being rescued by boats, swimming to safety, now you're in this Kafka-esque, system that foils you at every turn. The good news, if there is good news, is that this Rebuild North Carolina, the person who was in charge, her name was Laura Hogshead, finally was, one day she just was let go or something happened and she's no longer employed. It took me 31 stories and 2.5 years to get that done. And I'm going to just publicly say it was a goal. And it wasn't a goal because I had something personal. It was a goal because I knew that she was accountable for all the terrible things that were happening. So, in sum, take care of these folks, not just in eastern North Carolina, because there's still people out of their house. But when it comes time, we need funds for mental health for all hurricane survivors, wildfires, all natural disasters, because climate change it's a mental health crisis as well as a planetary crisis. I'm done. Oh, he needs it too.
Okay, good morning. I'm really honored to be here. I was really touched when I got the invitation to be in this panel by Melba. Thank you. And it's great to be in the company of all these wonderful concerned people. So I'm a professor at Duke University. I'm a psychiatrist and now mostly a neuroscience researcher. And I'm going to talk about climate change and mostly focus on the impacts on trauma and PTSD, as well as other psychiatric disorders, depression, anxiety, and suicidal thoughts and ideation. So I'm going to draw this little bit of this dichotomy here. I think about effects of climate change on mental health in two broad categories. So the first one is existential concerns about and distress about the climate, concerns about impacts on ecosystems, concerns about future generations, and so on and so forth. These are, in my mind, somewhat biased towards affecting citizens of the first world. What I'm really going to talk about is not mental health consequences about climate change. I'm going to talk about mental health consequences from climate change. And these are more biased towards developing world citizens. Not that we're not affected in the U.S., as Lisa and Goldie talked about. This is stuff that we all know, projections from 2 degrees Celsius of warming, agricultural yields going down, air pollution, a lot more war and climate, a lot more war and armed conflicts, and severe drought. But what about the impacts on mental health? This is, until very recently, quite overlooked. This is, again, showing what we've experienced in the last 8 years, an exponential rise in climate, in temperatures. And so, what are some of the effects of this, and particularly, what are the effects of this increase in temperature on things that lead to mental health? So, first is drought, crop failure, food insecurity, military and armed conflicts, like I mentioned. And that one often leads to human displacement, mass migration, refugees. And of course, we also experience a lot more floods, fires, hurricanes, more infectious diseases. Women are experience this burden disproportionately, and the global South experiences this disproportionately. And all of these kinds of events expose people to trauma, to acute stress, to violence, and violence leading to trauma and chronic stress. So some of the mental health sequelae of these kinds of events from increased temperature, grief, destruction of homes, property, livestock, as Lisa really nicely illustrated in her stories, worry about food, worry about resources, anxiety, safety concerns, trauma from violence and civil conflict, from sexual assault, from torture, PTSD from increased exposure to trauma. And I mentioned suicidal thoughts and behaviors from hopelessness and loss of land and crops and livelihood, and then medical problems. Other sequelae include just the direct effect of hot days on mental health. So when you have heat waves, there's increased rates of self-harm, suicide. There's increased rates of interpersonal conflict. There's increased rates of violence. And because heat really creates increases irritability and increases impulsivity. So we have these. We have also lower efficacy of psychotropics, of medications for mental health. And who are the most vulnerable? These are the people most affected by the weather, the meteorological stressors. The low-income women in the U.S. versus high-income men are twice as likely, or twice as affected. People who live in homes that are poorly equipped, as Lisa mentioned, and people who are less mobile to respond to extreme weather events. Outdoor workers, farm workers, factory workers who work in facilities without air conditioning, and loss of livelihood. And the most vulnerable will experience the most trauma. So this is from Los Angeles, 2021, showing the increased number of violent crimes with the increase in temperature. So as you go from 60 degrees to 95 degrees, a 12% increase in violent crimes, and violent crimes leading, of course, to trauma and PTSD. This is a very interesting result of exposure to trauma. And all of these types of trauma could and do result from climate change. But I call your attention to the green bars, and you can see that the chance of developing PTSD after trauma is the largest, with childhood sexual abuse and rape, but also combat and being molested and attacked. So this is very important. PTSD, as many of you know, has 4 sort of cardinal symptom areas: intrusive thoughts, recurring thoughts about your trauma, hypervigilance and irritability and anxiety, and then avoidance of reminders or even places or people that remind you of the trauma, and then various cognitive and emotional distortions and symptoms. So we also have increase in suicidal thoughts and behaviors with climate change. This you see a lot with people who are dependent on agriculture and droughts and famine. And and people who live in certain types of very autocratic governments are also more at risk. So one of the areas that I've studied in my lab is looking at the intensity of natural disasters, which have increased with climate change. And we're all familiar with these various natural disasters. And there's a whole constellation of factors that really lead to increased armed conflict and armed civil conflict and war. These result from food scarcity, resource scarcity, livestock loss and theft, and desertification and human displacement. And these all are sort of set the stage for armed conflict and civil conflict. These are some of the countries, the ones in orange, that are most affected by armed violence. And these are also the ones that are most affected by climate change. And when you have armed conflict and military or civil war, you have refugees. You have people traveling long distances. When people travel long distance, they are vulnerable to trauma. They're vulnerable to sexual assault. So these are the countries in the global south which are most vulnerable to climate change and its various impacts. I mentioned, when you have migration and refugees, you have people traveling through conflict zones, living unsheltered, living in unsafe spaces, traveling in cars that are overly packed, trucks, boats, and so forth. Women refugees are very much more affected because of sexual trauma. And then you have a loss of community and social support because people are on the move. And this kind of just encapsulates what I just said. We also, in the global south, have this, what I call a collision of climate and capacity. So this is the dam in Derna, which, how many of you remember the flood in Libya? I believe it was in Libya. So there were actually two dams that failed. But the reason they failed is that they were in very horrible disrepair. And that's because the country could not support the repair of these dams. So you have this collision of climate, which, we had this heavy rains and floods, and then you have these dams in disrepair. More than 20,000 people died, 845,000 displaced. This is just showing the Derna before and after the floods of 2023. Just images of people traveling, fleeing from conflict zones. Yazidi women in Syria, internally displaced persons. So I've studied more on hurricanes and how they've affected South Florida. And the reason we did this is we had access to data about mental health effects of hurricanes in South Florida. And I won't go through this slide in detail, but it's really, the hurricane effects are not just the hurricanes, but it's warmer oceans, it's thermal expansion of the water, and leads to more storm surge and higher levels of water in the flooding. Again, sea level rise in the last 50 years, Arctic, ice melting, and thermal expansion, as I mentioned, is a big part of it. This was a study we published. I want to recognize Molly Mansour, who was a student who worked on this project. And we looked at residents of South Florida, and we projected that with increased sea level rise, that we would have much higher rates of exposure to Category 4 and 5 hurricanes and property destruction. This shows the sea level rise in various parts of South Florida, and we looked at 3 different scenarios. 1.5 degrees rise in sea level, or sea level rise from 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, and 4 degrees. And we use data from Tropical Storm Sandy, Tropical Storm Ike, and then Hurricane Charlie in Florida. And we looked at 3 different symptom areas: PTSD, depression, and anxiety. This is showing from Hurricane Charlie the rise in these 3 conditions: anxiety, major depression, and PTSD. And again, a dramatic rise of trauma, with trauma exposure rising symptoms. Similarly for the other events. And here, I'm basically, these are projections that we made. The millions of, number of people in millions that would be affected by a Category 1 or a Category 3 storm. So 2 minutes, okay. So 2 million people affected from sea level rise with a Category 5 storm, and 1 million affected with sea level rise from a Category 3 storm. And I have a breakdown of the different conditions: anxiety, depression, and PTSD. So I'm going to skip to the implications because I want to just spend a minute on the potential remedies. I think that there's really needs to be more disaster preparedness to address specifically mental health, community education, emergency responder education, infrastructure for protecting vulnerable populations in location who are in vulnerable locations, and systems that integrate governance and economics and infrastructure, as well as technology and information. So what about reparations for climate change? This is was very new to me when I learned about this. California filed suit a couple years ago against ExxonMobil because they alleged that ExxonMobil and these oil and gas companies knew about the climate change effects. They're looking for damages that are way, way bigger than even the largest settlement to date, which was against big tobacco, $246 billion in 1998. And then a lawsuit by Puerto Rico in combination with 25 other states. U.S. Supreme Court has declined to hear this. So anyway, $200 billion in damages for Puerto Rico. It's actually would not cover much, but I'm gonna just So that's my presentation, and I'll just defer my the questions with the rest of the panel. Thank you.
Thank you all for your presentations. Very informative and gives us a lot of insight on why Lisa and I wake up enraged every day because in addition to these things happening, they're not just happening in a vacuum, they're also happening, there seems to be complicity at the highest levels by people, either through just pretending that climate change isn't happening, that we're not having environmental racism, environmental injustices, but working toward just taking us back. And as we know, the previous administration was very forward-leaning on environmental justice, on doing things to improve the conditions and in which we live, to build the infrastructure to prepare for that, and noting and also acknowledging the disparate impacts of these things. And now we have an administration that is not just indifferent, but is hostile to issues of environmental justice And if somebody's recording this, if that gets sent to Washington and they get mad at me, I don't care. And but we have to. And then I may have my name on some list and stuff, and that just makes me feel on a can't fly list or can't come back into the country if I leave. So I have a few questions here. So Goldie, can you talk a little bit? You mentioned like there's been this research that's showing the impact of pollution and things, how that's exacerbating Alzheimer's and dementias and things like that. What is your research showing? And if you are not able to, if they like cut your grants where you can look at different communities, what's that going to do for this body of knowledge that needs to grow and just kind of is in its infancy? So how will you cope with that?
Okay, that's a great question. One great thing is our administration is doing everything it can to help us to see ways out with that. But clearly, so first let me take this one with regard to studying different populations, and there has been so much concern about including different groups in research. And again, I think there's a lot of misinterpretation of what this inclusion and equity. And of course, I don't have the authority to speak on this from our institution, so I'll be very, very mindful. But our goal was to be inclusive, to assure that when there is a drug or an intervention of any kind, that all populations really should be represented in that. And we've focused on that for a long time. But when there is a termination of a grant, it really does upset the apple cart. I mean, people are hired on these grants. And so there are young people who are very concerned about their income, and they should be. And of course, without people, we absolutely cannot get the research done. Without people, without technology, without the computers and the robots, the research really just cannot be done. So it does create a problem. It also creates an opportunity for us to think differently about how we're going to do things, how we phrase things, how we frame things. And so we're now taking the time to figure that out. And I'm just grateful that our administrators are trying everything they can. They're keeping us informed. They're trying doing everything they can to assure us that, all of the research won't go away if certain things happen. And it is happening on all campuses, all kinds of campuses that, people are losing their funding. There's discussion about indirect costs which support. And so there will be challenges, but I'm trying to remain optimistic and let the administration do what they do. So yes, and with regard to some of the environmental pollutants, these are recent studies that are coming out, and it does as both of us talked about the differences in gender, actually, well in sex. Women are on the burden side of many of these conditions, and there are physiological things that are going on, hormonal things that are going on that are particularly in the Alzheimer's space. So it's very real.
Thank you. Lisa, have you found, there was, when Helene happened last fall, there was a lot of misinformation, deliberate misinformation about what FEMA could do, and it was done from a political perspective to try to harm the prior administration, about they weren't coming to help and all of that. So what have you seen, have you, in your reporting, just any kind of attitudinal change, or people a clearer understanding of what the role climate has and what role, the administration's their attitudes, how that will impact their ability to get care and all of that? Have you reported on any of that?
Well, I talked to a couple people. Okay. I talked to a couple people a few weeks ago about FEMA, and FEMA, there was an enormous amount of disinformation. There's still enormous amount of disinformation. There's someone on Twitter who I will not platform, but it's like a constant onslaught of nonsense. But I think that FEMA and some of these agencies that are in charge of disaster relief have done a really poor job of explaining what they do. And so that's left this information gap of, well, we don't know what they do, we'll just make it up. And the two people I spoke with who are Helene survivors said, well, we still want FEMA, but we want them to be more connected to the community. We want more communication. We want things explained. The level of opacity, I think, is what has caused a lot of this concern. So my suggestion would be, and I don't know if it's possible under this administration, but you need to break things down and explain how things are. And if you get denied a benefit, why did you get denied? And why did your neighbor not get denied? I mean, there's just a lot of a lack of understanding. And it's not on the fault of the folks. It's because there's not a lot of clarity on what's going on. So I think Helene is going to be, it's a very unusual disaster because of the terrain and the level of devastation. And I think there's been, different than it was during Hurricane Florence and Matthew, that was a different time. Even though we were under similar administration during part of that time, it was still, the vehemence had not really kicked in as much. So now there is. So, and I think people are also skeptical because of what happened in Eastern North Carolina, and they have reason to be. So I think it's going to take a long time to win back the trust of folks. And the way to do that is to be transparent and to be connected to the community and, be connected to the churches and the youth groups and all that. And that's the only way to really repair that relationship.
Thank you. Raj, you were talking about, you started out showing the impacts a lot in the global South. And so kind of, would you say third world or not third world, or just more?
Yeah. Third world, I guess the new politically correct term, although we're not supposed to be politically correct, is developing world or developing economies. Yeah.
Okay, so one of the things you talked about was it's worse in autocratic regimes. So are we like kind of getting ourselves set up for worse because we're maybe having an autocratic? Y'all see, I don't care. Okay, so the autocracies and that are shutting down a lot of the resources that help people in these situations, or denying that climate change is real. So is that something that's lending to making our situation worse here in the United States, and particularly in this part of the country?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, and I'll just bring up a specific example related to Goldie's presentation about her genome-wide association study, right? And when you do genetic studies, you really need to have representation from people of all ancestries, people from African ancestry, Asian ancestry, European ancestry, because, the job of science is to make conclusions that are unbiased. But we know that the genetic structure of people of African ancestry is very, very different from the genetic structure of European ancestry or Native American ancestry because of thousands of years or hundreds of thousands of years of genetic history. So when you do science and you don't take special measures to include people of African ancestry, you're going to come up with scientific results that are biased. And those scientific results that are biased are not going to lead to the right treatments, the right management. And for an autocracy, when you do not support grants that promote diversity in genome-wide association studies, you're going to get science that's compromised and you're going to have treatments that are not as good as they could be. And for a country or for an administration that's like so focused on efficiency, when you have this kind of situation, you're going to have people from any group that's not white not getting the right treatments, which will increase costs of health care and all kinds of other impacts. So I think that's the problem with the autocratic system, that just dismisses diversity.
I recently learned, and when I was working on about the brain bank that they have at a research center associated with Johns Hopkins, that when they map the human genome, as you look at the genes that are included in there, something like 85% of those genes are from white people. But when you look at the global population, white people only account for like 16% of the population. So that is so counterproductive to understanding the health and the genetics of the entire world. And when we have just a minute or so, but how do you get, or do you see more reluctance among people of color to be engaged in studies, to seek out mental health? Because in my family, it's like, you don't do that, you just like tough it out a lot of times. And the people who are most in need aren't participating in the studies or aren't seeking it out. So could you start, Raj?
Yeah. This is a big problem and a big challenge. I'm an investigator with one of my colleagues. We're looking at black men's brain health, especially aging black men who played professional football, because we want to look at increased risk of dementia and cognitive decline and so forth. But I think that to address your question is that even in our research, we see a very clear reluctance to participate in research, and this has a very long history. I mean, it's a skepticism and distrust of the medical community. In the U.S., of course, African Americans were not even treated at hospitals. At least in the South, and they had to drive hours to find a black physician and so forth. And then, there was things like the Tuskegee study, which, had, really atrocities towards African Americans. So,
Goldie?
So I'll just piggyback on that, and that's I agree with Raj, and then it's not only the historical perspective, but it's the current perspective. And so some of the very people we need in these studies are people who are on the receiving end of these environmental justices, the structural inequities that we talked about, and just everyday racism and discrimination. And so there is a distrust. We are recruiting 13,000 people across ancestries, and we're finding that we're having to do the education. We're having to establish that trustworthiness within communities. So will these communities, and it's not just race differences in race and ethnicity, but will these people in those Tier 1 counties I talked about, or those counties where you were, Lisa, who experienced this devastation with housing, are they interested in doing that? Are they interested in finding food? Or getting the lights, making sure the lights are on, or recovering from a hurricane or a tornado, and living in a space, in an apartment for not even an apartment, but a hotel room for 4 years. That person is less likely to participate in your study. So there are many different reasons why that is the situation, and I think it's incumbent upon people like us, well, it's going to take a complex array of people for us to change this paradigm. It's going to take your stories, people understanding that someone is concerned. It's going to take our politicians and our policymakers, and it's going to take us to get out and vote also. But anyway, that's another thing. That's another story. But really and truly, it is complex, and people remember things. People remember why Highway 52 was put through here and what that did to families. But I do think we've made a lot of progress in the past few years I've been here in Winston. I think we've made a lot of progress with different communities, but how do we scale that up so that it does get to that level of trustworthiness? How do we do that? And especially when we now hear that DEI is a bad word. And some of our partners are actually saying that the current political climate has impacted their ability to recruit people.
Okay, well, we could talk about this all day, and I really want to thank our panelists, Goldie, Lisa, Raj, for sharing your information, your knowledge, and expertise with us, and so thank you all for coming.